Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to tonight's event, Music, Dance, and the Politics of Memory, featuring the writer and critic and historian Jeremy Eichler and his recent award-winning book, Time's Echo, The Second World War, the Holocaust, and the Music of Remembrance. I am so thrilled to have Jeremy here. I cannot tell you. I first met Jeremy many, many years ago when we were both graduate students in modern European history. He at Columbia, me at NYU, and we met actually at the Remark Institute, which still exists today at NYU. And we sort of followed, I always felt like we were almost twins in a way, we sort of followed parallel paths. We both moved into criticism, Jeremy more than I. And we both embarked on projects on the cultural history of music, and in my case, dance, and have had ongoing conversations over many, many years about the relationship between criticism, scholarship, and the arts. Jeremy lives in Boston and has served for 18 years as the chief classical music critic of the Boston Globe. He's also written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, and many other publications, and has just this year taken up a newly created professorship in music history and the public humanities at Tufts University. So he's moved over to this side of the bench. This season, he is also the first writer in residence of the London Philharmonic Orchestra. His book, Time's Echo, has won many awards and accolades and has led to an impressive array also of events which have involved musicians and composers even, bringing the Academy and the Music Hall together. Although tonight this will be more of a talk event. To discuss Jeremy's book and its themes more broadly, I will be joined by Uli Baer, University Professor of Comp Lit, German and English at NYU, and Director of the Center for the Humanities, which is co-producing tonight's event. Uli has written widely on German, English, and American literature and the arts, including perhaps most notably for this event, books about Rilke, about trauma and photography, about trauma and the experience of modernity in Baudelaire and Celan. We are also joined by Mike Beckerman, who is the Carol and Milton Petrie Professor of Music at NYU and has written extensively about Czech and Eastern European music, especially in the work of Janacek and Dvorak, and more generally on music and war, music and Roma gypsies, music in the concentration camps, and Jewish music. Hi, Uli. Finally, I would like to extend thanks to NYU for its generous funding and support of this program, and to the staff at both CBA and the Center for the Humanities, Christian Doroso, Mickey Kaneda, Shui Sen, Kyla Bowen, and Audrey Pettit, who all worked so hard to put this event together tonight. So what would the run of the show for this evening is as follows. Jeremy is going to start us off and talk for 15 or 20 minutes about the music and ideas in Time's Echo. And we will then move to a discussion in which each of the three of us, will sort of introduce what our sort of particular take on this material is, and we will all then have a conversation. After the event, we invite you to continue the conversation with everyone upstairs for a reception where you may also, if you wish, purchase a signed copy of Time's Echo. So now I will welcome Jeremy and let him take over from here.
Thank you so much. It's really such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to NYU. Thank you to the Center for Ballet and the Arts. Thank you to the Center for the Humanities. And thank you also to all the staff of both centers, again, that worked so hard to put tonight together. I've been looking forward to tonight's event for many reasons, but one of them is just a chance to be here at CBA that Jennifer founded. As she mentioned, we've known each other for a long time, and Mahler has this expression that he once described himself and Strauss as two miners tunneling into the same mountain from opposite sides and hoping to meet somewhere in the middle. Turns out that the middle happens to be the CBA. Who knew all this time? It's really, really a pleasure to be here. I can't help sharing a word of admiration. As critics and historians, I think Jennifer's criticism over the years, if I could say, and her writing and her history writing, it struck a balance that's kind of been a model for me in many ways of writing about, on the one hand, contemporary events in the dance world with a sense of the long sense of history behind it, and then also writing about history with a sense of a kind of immediacy that makes us feel like there's a vibrancy there, perhaps as vibrant as the performance that we just saw the night before. So that kind of interpenetration of criticism and historical writing has always been something I've admired and appreciated, and it's great to be here. I thought that we might begin with just about 90 seconds of music, just to open our ears, so to speak, and momentarily kind of coordinate our own inner temporalities in the way that music can do for us, to establish this particular space that we'll be inhabiting together for the next 60 minutes or 90 or however long we go. What we're about to play is just about 1 minute from Shostakovich's late setting for soprano and cello of a poem by Alexander Bloch called Ophelia's Song. The singer here sings in Russian about the memory of and the attachment to a distant love or perhaps a distant ideal. In December 1963, Dmitri Shostakovich visited London and heard a performance of Benjamin Britten's opera Peter Grimes, an opera staged in a small fishing village on the Suffolk coast of England. It tells the story of a lone man cast as an outsider and then destroyed by his own society. Benjamin Britten was not in London at that time, so Shostakovich returned to his hotel room and unburdened his heart in a letter. Britten spoke no Russian, so he had it translated when he received it, and I'm just going to read a few sentences from that letter. Shostakovich writes, "They say you are again spending much time on concert performance work. This certainly is good, but I wish that you should create as much as possible. Your music is the most outstanding phenomenon of the 20th century, and for me it is the source of profound and powerful impressions. Write as much as possible. It is necessary for humanity and certainly for me. What does it mean for a work to be necessary for us as humanity, for us, necessary for us as individuals? Perhaps it has something to do with carrying forward some essential sense of knowledge about the past. I use the word knowledge in opposition to the word information, which, as we know, is very different. When I think of information, I think of what we find on Wikipedia or in archives. Information is everywhere these days, of course. We can, in fact, sit on our sofas and just through our phones, we have an incredible amount more information available to us about the past than at any time in human history. We can sit on our sofas and just surf the ruins of Pompeii or tour the Cairo Geniza and its contents. It's all there for the taking. But even as we have so many terabytes of information at our fingertips, and so easily available, something else seems to be on the wane. Our ability to experience an authentic connection to the past, to view our own world as its inheritor, to practice active remembrance or commemoration. It's been said that previous generations knew much less about the past than we do, but they felt a much greater sense of identity and continuity with it. All the bridges, wrote the writer Stefan Zweig, between today and yesterday are broken. How might art in general and music in particular span this rupture? In this, what we're living through today, I think of as the kind of twilight of living memory of the era of the Second World War and the Holocaust, as the generation that directly experienced this dark heart of the 20th century is increasingly receding. It feels like a timely question to ask about art's power to bridge these ruptures. It's one I thought about across my own years of work as a classical music critic and across my training and research as a historian of modern Europe. And it's really the question at the center of Time's Echo. It's a book about many things, but at its most basic level, it seeks to reimagine the power and presence of art in our lives today. It seeks to entirely rethink, in a way, the potential meanings of classical music by recognizing its ability to serve as that bridge to eras past, one that deepens our sense of felt contact with these earlier eras and provides us a kind of gateway to understanding and empathy. The history that the book describes includes the tragedies and suffering of previous generations, but also their dreams of dignity and freedom, their visions for a just society that I suggest are no less vital for having not yet come to pass. The four extraordinary, I explore these themes and these questions through the four extraordinary musical lives. The four figures at the center of the book, the four composers are Dmitri Shostakovich and Benjamin Britten, which you heard about in that opening story. Also Arnold Schoenberg and Richard Strauss. Each of the four of them in some ways stood at four different windows overlooking the same catastrophe. They each experienced the kind of convulsions at the heart of the 20th century in very different ways, and they each afterwards wrote each of them wrote one extraordinary musical memorial, and the book tells the story of both their lives and their art, how they kind of transposed their experience of this era and its profound ruptures into these musical memorials. The four musical memorials whose stories the book tells are Arnold Schoenberg's Survivor from Warsaw, which was one of the very first musical memorials to the Holocaust, Richard Strauss's work Metamorphosen, Dmitri Shostakovich's Babi Yar Symphony, and Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. Isaac Stern used to ask musicians, the violinist Isaac Stern, of course, used to ask musicians when they came to play for him, he would say, to show him not how they play the music, but why. It's a distinction, I think, that needs to be also made about listening. This is a book not about the how of listening, which I think of as the domain of music appreciation, but really about the why. I don't answer the question of the why, of course, in a definitive way, but I do pose it with real intention from many different angles, and I suggest some paths forward. I also posit that even to ask the question of why represents its own kind of small gesture of repair, about which I'll return to in just a few minutes. Schoenberg, Strauss, Shostakovich, and Britten, we know these composers. Some of us, they're of course at the heart of the 20th century musical canon. You know, there are biographies out there freely available. I always felt in reading about their lives that something was missing. Time's echo, in a way, tells the extraordinary stories, not just of their lives, but also the way they registered the rupture at the dark heart of the 20th century. The Holocaust in this book is really not presented as something that was done to a set of ethnic minorities, but really an event that happened to humanity. I quote Jürgen Habermas, who famously said that it was a rupture in the layer of solidarity among all who wear a human face. Each of these composers that I write about in different ways were heirs, inheritors of music's grand 19th century utopian dreams. We can think of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and it's the final movement with the setting of Schiller's Ode to Joy, Alle Menschen werden Brüder, with that all humanity will become like siblings. This was the vision that they inherited, and yet they lived through an era that saw this grotesque perversion of that vision and that rupture that Habermas's words give us insight into. I approached each of the musical memorials that I write about not only as music, but as what I call spaces of encounter, shifting constellations of sound and meaning that reach across time. And as music, the book argues, they do that reaching differently than other art forms. I hope I'll have a chance to talk a little bit in a comparative sense in our conversation part of the night about dance versus music. But really, one of the central ideas of Time's Echo is that music has its own way of remembering. In fact, I could say, if I had to distill Time's Echo or its real central argument into a single sentence, it's that idea that it's not just we who remember music as individuals, but music that also remembers us as a society. Music distills these wordless truths from these earlier eras and is capable of carrying them forward. If you think about it, notated music does this in a very special way, right? When a composer, let's say in 1824, distills worlds of fantasy and thought and emotion, perhaps something about the world in which they're living at that moment, their society, crystallizes, distills these thoughts, puts them down on a page, and then fast forward 200 years later, we hear that music performed in front of our ears. What we are listening to is, in some very basic sense, literally the past speaking again in the present. And in this way, I talk about music as being the language of time's non-linearity. It brings closer that which is distant. It kind of short-circuits the forward march of the years. And if you think about it, it shares these qualities with memory itself, right? Because memory, by definition, challenges the pastness of the past and the objective distance of history. Memory, by definition, brings closer that which is distant. An event that happened maybe years ago to us can sometimes haunt us in our memories much more vividly than something that happened just yesterday. And so in all of these ways, music bears these deep elective affinities with memory, and really the project, amidst all the other stories, the biographies, the musical memorials, that the invitation at the heart of the work is also to think differently about music itself as a medium of memory, and not just think, but listen differently, to hear the music as testimony and as culture's memory. What might it mean to bear witness as members of a later generations to this music's original act of witness. I thought I might give folks just a little taste of the writing itself. This was Jennifer's idea that I should. The writing will come back to the approach maybe in the discussion if it lends itself. But I thought I would perhaps just read a couple of pages, and then before turning over the floor to our group conversation, where we will maybe revisit some of these themes that I was just been telling you all about, maybe talk about some of the individual works, or maybe my distinguished panelists will take things in a very different direction. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. But to start, to conclude my own remarks, I'll share a little bit from the from the opening pages of the book. The opening begins with what I call a prelude, and its title is In the Shade of the Oak. The wooded slopes of the Ettersberg stand in the center of Germany, a few miles north of Weimar. Beginning in the 18th century, the area served as the playground of dukes who went there for hunting, and later as the preserve of poets who traversed its rugged hills while contemplating the wonders of nature. No less in eminence than Goethe, the greatest of all German poets, traveled often to the forests of the Ettersberg, and over the years he grew particularly fond of one large oak tree near a clearing with expansive views of the countryside. On a bright autumn morning in 1827, a banquet-like breakfast was laid out in the shade of this grand oak. Leaning back against its regal trunk, Goethe feasted on roast partridges, drank wine from a gold cup, and gazed out at the rolling landscape. Here, he declared, a person feels great and free, the way he should always be. After Goethe's death, as a cult of reverence formed around him as the standard-bearer of both German genius and European humanism, the legend of his favorite local tree evidently survived all the way down to one summer day more than a century later. That day in 1937, a group of prisoners was led into the same high forests of the Ettersberg, stopping at a limestone ridge just 6 miles north of Weimar. Under harsh conditions and with minimal equipment, these men cleared away the trees to make room for a concentration camp. As the prisoners labored day after day, building their own future prison, their guards identified one particular oak that would not be felled. This oak, it was determined, must be the mythic Goethe's oak. And so the anointed tree was left standing, and in the years that followed, the concentration camp of Buchenwald rose up around it on all sides. To the Nazis who created Buchenwald, Goethe's oak represented a tangible link to the German history at its most illustrious, a history that proved the German people's cultural superiority while pointing toward the 1,000-year empire of their dreams. To the inmates of Buchenwald, the tree took on a different meaning as an incongruous vestige of the older Germany, a potent reminder of European culture's utopian promise, and a silent witness to unspeakable crime. Over the course of the next 7 years, the men and women in the surrounding camp were enslaved, murdered, and worked to death. Some of Hitler's victims, according to one account, were hanged from the branches of Goethe's oak. The tree itself eventually stopped producing leaves. In one photograph taken by prisoners with a stolen camera, its branches appear bare and skeletal, reaching up into the empty sky. Some prisoners linked the tree's fate with that of Nazi Germany, which by the summer of 1944 was careening towards its own downfall. At approximately noon on August 24, 1944, 129 American aircraft converged over the camp and rained down their fury, dropping 1,000 bombs and incendiaries and successfully destroying a munitions factory attached to the Buchenwald complex. That factory had been their prime target, but there were additional casualties. 100 SS men, nearly 400 camp inmates, and the old oak tree, which had been scorched by flames. The camp leadership had it felled and sawed for firewood, but one resourceful inmate named Bruno Appitz, a communist prisoner who had survived the camp since its founding, managed to smuggle back to his barracks an entire block of the tree's heartwood. With his fellow prisoners standing by, Appitz risked his life to carve from the wood a bas-relief in the form of a death mask. He called it Das letzte Gesicht, the last face. This simple, rough-hewn sculpture individualizes the enormity of Nazi violence through the prism of a single face. It can be thought of as among the early memorials to the Second World War and to the events that years later would be called the Shoah or the Holocaust. The grief that lines this last face is grief for all that died at Buchenwald, for the inmates, but also perhaps for what the oak represented. That is, the grand European promise of a high culture of poetry, music, and literature, and the very idea of a humanism that might one day unite all people as equals. While Appitz was at work, chisel in hand, another memorial inspired by the heartwood of German culture was taking shape some 300 miles away. In Richard Strauss's villa in the mountain-ringed town of Garmisch, the 80-year-old composer wrote out 2 short poems by Goethe, the first one opening with the lines, Niemand wird sich selber kennen, sich von einem selbst ich trennen. No one will ever know himself, separate himself from his inner being. The second poem begins, what happens in the world no one actually understands. These reflections on the limits of self-knowledge must have resonated with Strauss, a composer who had spectacularly failed to understand his own actions in the world in which he found himself in 1933. During the years of the Third Reich, he had severely misjudged his own surroundings, remained in Germany, and forever tainted his reputation by working with the Nazis in the area of cultural policy. He also witnessed the suffering of his Jewish family members, which included his daughter-in-law and his grandchildren, and the wartime destruction of his true spiritual homes, the opera houses of Munich, Dresden, and Vienna. Now, in August 1944, the world-weary Strauss began work on a choral setting of the first of the Goethe poems, but never completed it. Instead, he swept the musical ideas, which still bore the ghosted impressions of Goethe's language, into a new composition, a spiraling work of mournful grandeur entitled Metamorphosen. It would be an elegy to German culture, a death mask in sound. And it would also be one of Strauss's most moving musical utterances, speaking forcefully to the emotions while sealing its secrets behind the music's veil of wordless beauty. On the score's final page, Strauss inlaid a quotation from the funeral march of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, and below it he inscribed a single lapidary phrase, in memoriam. Unlike the artist of the sculpture carved at Buchenwald, however, Strauss did not specify what precisely his music was attempting to remember. To this day, whenever the piece is performed, the question reappears. It is no longer his to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. I think we're all going to come up now, and Uli, why don't you sit right here in the middle? Okay, this is going to be very informal, but I think maybe we could begin with just each of the three of us saying a little bit about, very briefly, thoughts we may have had as we read the book or concerns we may bring from our own fields. And I'm happy to begin just because that's what we decided. So I'm a historian of Europe, like Jeremy said, and I work primarily on dance. And as I was reading Jeremy's book, which I've now read twice, I I kept thinking, would it be possible for me to transpose some of what Jeremy's done into the art form that I know so well? After all, in some ways, it seemed to me that dance was only about memory, that it is an art form that is governed by memory. It has no written, or very few written, sources, and it is not written down. It is passed primarily from person to person, from body to body, and so therefore it depends on the memory of the dancers who learn the dances to both produce them and pass them on. So it's also very much, often at least, tied to music. So it has a kind of dependence in a way, because it does, I think, depend on this sort of, as Balanchine, who I've written probably the most about in my exploration of dance, would say, music is the floor. It's the main thing we have to dance with and on. So music becomes also a very important thing. So there is this sort of an art form of memory dependent on another art form of memory. I was struck by Jeremy's quoting of Lorca when he says, all arts are capable of duende, but where it finds greatest range naturally is in music, dance, and spoken poetry, because they need a living interpreter to, as Jeremy put it, channel the fugitive memories and forgotten pain of the past into what Lorca called an exact present. And it's certainly true that dance does that, and I'm wondering also whether dance is something that, and this would be my question in a way, shows the limits of an art of memory, because it's also an art of forgetting, and it is forgotten constantly. Dances disappear, they go away, nobody remembers how to do them, they can't be reconstituted, and because dance is also forgotten, not always entirely, but also partially, dances change, and they have a certain fragile quality, which may be part of their appeal as well, and part of their power. So I'm just wondering if the idea of memory in dance is something that is sort of sustainable, as something that could become a monument. And I think only of one dance, or I can think of many examples, but one dance that might be the 12, which was done in 1923 at the end or in the middle of the revolutionary years in Russia by Balanchine. And it had a text to it. It had a text which was an Alexander Bloch poem. And he set this poem of the 12 to chanted recitation of the poem and a kind of folk dance which is now forgotten and lost. So, that would be one possibility, but it is tied to words. So that raises another question. So I'm not sure where this leaves me, but I just wanted to raise those questions and issues before we sort of move along. And I have more to say later about the language that Jeremy uses in his writing and the ways in which he himself is sort of a bearer of memory and closes the circle with the language. And I think that maybe language does have a part even when we're dealing with art forms that that are wordless, as you put it. So Mike, would you like to talk a little bit
thank you. I won't step on your meditations about language, but I will say how marvelously evocative the language is in this book, and the way the narrative is meticulously yet seemingly effortlessly stitched together. I'm sure it wasn't effortless at all. It is part of the genuine power of the book. And while you are such a generous writer, you don't shy away from taking sides occasionally and telling it how it is if you feel that that that's your responsibility, and that was also very moving. So I was inspired by this to think about a couple of other things. So I would call my remarks an echo of Time's Echo. But I would start with some works that were written during the war. Most of the works you talk about were after the war, and if you consider Strauss a memoriam, then it's right at the end. But let's go to Tashkent. In Tashkent, Mikhail Gnesin had been driven out of various places, ended up in Tashkent, and wrote a piano trio, which he dedicated to the memory of our perished children. And we wonder what children he might have had in mind. But certainly by 1943, there was ample evidence of extraordinary brutality going on. And his trio tells a little story. Imagine if I am a violin playing pizzicato. It opens like this. And this is sort of the opening theme, and it turns out it's a Yiddish song. Amos gave a Yiddele. So there was a little Jew, a little Jew, a little Jew. He had a little wife, a little wife, a little wife. They had a little son, a little son, a little son, and the son died. And that's this song. So by quoting this at the beginning of his trio, he suggests that he is referring to a particular group of perished children. And as Jeremy amply points out, Professor points out, you know, it wasn't done to mention and separate out the Jewish victims from the victims of fascism. And so this was a hidden meaning. And it's also another example of one of the moving and difficult things to think about, which is the secondary texts instrumental music gets when instrumental music quotes a song with a text. So, right, instrumental music doesn't have words, but if you quote words, then does it get words, and how does it affect the way you listen? Well, the second thing I want to talk about was something which occurred just about a year before Gnesin wrote his trio in 1943, and this was the destruction, the massacre of Lidice in Czechoslovakia as a reprisal for the Heydrich assassination. So 703 people were destroyed in a way. All the men were shot, the women were sent to camps, most of them died. 7 children were considered appropriate for Germanization and survived, and the rest were gassed. And so this was the destruction of Lidice, and the Czech composer Bohuslav Martinu wrote a memorial to Lidice, and he hid in it this tune, which is the Saint Wenceslas. And also, so you can hear so it's hidden in various ways in this piece, which has a series of outbursts. And one of the things that struck me, and I'd never thought about it before until I read Jeremy's book, is there's a huge outburst of this tune, and then a pianissimo repetition of the same thing, which seemed to me to be right exactly in the middle of the piece, a kind of Time's echo. The last thing I want to talk about is of a different flavor, but I'll try to make it quick. Hugo Haas was one of the most famous actors in Czechoslovakia. He was kind of a Czech Cary Grant, both a leading man and a comedian. Of course, he was Jewish. He came from a Brno Jewish family. His brother Pavel Haas was a student of Janáček's, and while Hugo could get out and got out of town in 1938 and came to the US, Pavel couldn't get out. So Hugo comes to the United States, you're an older European, you don't get to be a leading man again, so he plays roles like King of the Gypsies, the Bulgarian Prince, the Dutchman, and he makes enough money to start his own B-movie studio in Hollywood. So in 1951, he makes a film called Girl on the Bridge. Quickly sketch the plot. Hugo himself, writer, director, actor, plays an old watchmaker, a Holocaust survivor. And he's walking on a bridge and he sees a young woman about to throw herself off the bridge. He talks her down. The next day she comes to visit him in his shop. One thing leads to another and they fall in love and get married. Everything's fine except the boyfriend comes back, and the boyfriend was the reason that she was going to kill herself, and says, I'm going to steal her back from you. And the old man pleads with him, and the boyfriend says, okay, I'll leave you alone. But the boyfriend tells his cousin. Cousin comes that night to blackmail the old watchmaker, and as happens in these B-movies, they get into a little tussle. The cousin falls down, hits his head, dead. So Hugo, the watchmaker, gets rid of the body. So the scene that I'm going to sketch briefly is Hugo is ridden with guilt because the boyfriend has been arrested for the crime. He's unshaven, he's by the window, the rain's pouring down, and his wife, looking angelic, says, I can't stop thinking about it. And he says, what? He says, that poor boy, what he must be going through. And Hugo goes as if to go, and then he walks back, and she says, how desperate he must feel sitting there helplessly. And Hugo, the watchmaker, suddenly says, shut up, don't talk about him, and rushes out. And all there is a piano cluster. That's it. Oh, wait, no, that's not it. Because if you were to go back and follow it slowly, you would see that on the piano, with a black ribbon across it, is a photograph of his brother, Pavel Haas, who was killed in Auschwitz. So, absent nosy musicologists and film historians, this was not meant to be seen. Nobody would have seen it. You're following Hugo out. You're not looking on the piano for, and so this is, you deal with these extraordinary and monumental memorials, and I just thought this was the other end of the scale, the most modest idea of a memorial for only one person, to be known only by one person, and yet not less potent for that, and maybe in its own small way just as powerful.
Well, these are easy acts to follow. I don't play the piano, I don't dance. Thank you, Jeremy, for this amazing book. And I thought, so I'm a literary scholar, and I've worked a lot, and I wrote a book on the poet Paul Celan, who's one of the German language poets who tried to commemorate the Holocaust. And one of his lines was, in German, niemand zeugt für den Zeugen, which means nobody bears witness for the witness, which speaks to the isolation of the person who commemorates, who actually will not have any company or solidarity unless we actually receive that testimony. So Celan wrote these poems and felt, I'm writing them in total isolation, and he hoped for a readership. And your book is a kind of reception of these stories. And I thought I'd start from a question in the back of the book. There's in an epilogue, Jeremy quotes Marcel Proust, who says in a very moving, grandiose, and probably incorrect sentence, he says, through art alone, we are able to emerge from ourselves. And it's very lofty, and you would think Proust, and you also feel Proust in his cork-line study, he probably believed that. I do not believe that, actually, and I want to ask you whether you actually really believe that, and I thought in the book you give an answer in a way. So through art alone, we are able to emerge from ourselves, meaning we will actually leave the kind of solipsism of our self-concern to actually in some ways expand and open our hearts to other people's experiences, memories, and possibly even get a glimpse, without ever knowing what that would be, their suffering, as you say in this movie, for example. Without knowing, we know something is inscribed that he could not otherwise show. And I think what you actually answer this a little bit, and you say on another page, there is a kind of word for that, which you call empathy. And I'm kind of curious what you mean by kind of an empathic listening, a kind of listening with feeling, with kind of a feeling your way into it or something like that, beyond the confines of the self. So that's my first question. whether you truly believe that art is the only way of emerging from ourselves. I do actually believe what we do in these settings, the way Mike was just able to bring to life something for a moment, is another way in which we can emerge from ourselves, which is where Jenny says the body keeps the score in performance, and it's each time. So it's not just art, it's also something else, possibly. And then I have one second question, and I think since we are in this room of CBA, it's a bit shorthand, but kind of the method of this book, I believe, is something that one could characterize for some people in the room, very familiar, some people less familiar. The cultural critic Walter Benjamin in the 1930s and 40s comes up with an idea to write history against the grain because he doesn't believe history is ever settled. They are facts that happened, things that occurred, and they are done, but they haven't quite concluded, and if we feel they have concluded, we are probably denying the kind of potential for some other kind of outcome that was not realized because these things were cut short, cut dead, cut off at the stem in a way. And what Benjamin says, so this is very interesting, you think it's very opening, it's kind of a sort of, he has all these words for it, profane, illumination, etc. But Benjamin also says something rather more unsettling, that history is never concluded, it's also never conclusive. And what Benjamin would have said, I think, in a way, and Benjamin, we like to think of him as a leftist critic, he's a kind of messianic Marxist, but he has moments when he says this open-endedness of history doesn't allow us to actually make some conclusions. And I was curious about, to sort of sharpen this point a little bit, this kind of dialectical approach to history, that you are putting one thing from the past in relation to one thing in the present. And I'll give you two examples in your book where I thought this is really pronounced and it's complicated. So Britain, as I understand, writes a memorial to World War II and uses a poet from World War I. As an academic, you can't really do that. And in some ways, I want to just really point that out. What is happening here, actually? He's using Owen, this is a poet about that event, and then he writes about this event. And in some ways, once we start doing that, we're opening it up to all sorts of relativism, and I'm going to use this poem to refer to that event, and then all the specificity that you just brought to light is completely gone, because then what we say, or the massacre at Barbie Yard, it's specific that it's there, done by those people, happened to those people. It's not just, just use any poem about suffering and, put it in, drop it in there. The first one. The second one is even more complicated in a way. When you talked about Strauss and you said, Richard Strauss, so he's compromised during the Nazi era, and you said he misjudged his context. Maybe he didn't. Maybe actually, and this is the controversy about Strauss, maybe he actually thought, I can accommodate, this will pass, or this will not pass. This will actually come to last. And look where we are in the world, where some of these ideas are completely, not just sort of accepted, but they're actually advanced in some ways. So what Strauss was, in some ways, for us to say, I think I'm 100% in agreement, he was wrong, absolutely wrong, morally wrong, politically wrong, personally wrong. And yet, maybe he didn't misjudge his situation, maybe we think that, but there could be another way of writing history where he didn't misjudge it at all, where actually he did the right thing. And he compromised himself according to standards that Benjamin would say they're kind of the standards of historical hindsight. You see what I'm saying, how these two moments are juxtaposing two episodes, 1940 Strauss, today our kind of conviction that we know what's right and wrong. This conviction for Benjamin would be so open that he would even say, history as we know, and you say this several times, both in post-war Germany and in the Soviet Union, how not just history is erased, but the ability to commemorate history. Your Benjaminian approach, I think, allows for this to kind of be guided into the right path, to say this is actually how to correctly remember it. And then you have a couple examples of memorials that are memorials which are these very academic, complex memorials where you actually don't see what's being commemorated. There's a kind of invisibility to it. But I'm just curious about the historical approach that juxtaposes two things, and then you have to end up with one interpretation that matters, where Benjamin wanted to say they're both in play and they're so open-ended that something very unsavory could emerge. That actually, we start to look at that event in the past, not from this one perspective, but from a different one. The Britain one is I would have another question about whether this book could actually be a model for other types of scholarship, or whether this is specific to the Western European experience. And I'll end with a quote from somebody else who's actually been very important in my way of reading literature. So Maya Angelou, the poet and novelist, said at one point, in another sentence as moving and beautiful and probably wrong as Proust's. I love this sentence, and she says about James Weldon Johnson, who taught at NYU. He wrote a book called God's Trombones in 1927, where he tried to recreate the speech patterns of the great black orators in the 19th century. He didn't hear these people anymore, but he felt he was the last one to be able to record how they were able to give these sermons that moved thousands. And Maya Angelou says, the only true example of grace in all of humanity is the African-American tradition that has produced art and culture in spite of hundreds of years of systematic oppression and suffering. And she means to say what you say with Proust, that art is that which takes us out of ourselves. So my question would be, for your next book, are you going to focus on another tradition, another context, and another set of writers? Thank you. So all that, right, exactly.
Right.
We'll leave the stage. We'll leave the stage.
Yes, yeah. I think we need Mike back at the piano. Thank you both. Thank you all three of you for these really wonderful, illuminating questions. It has been really meaningful to share from the book over the last year and just find time and again a lot of meaning in people's own separate angles of response to it. And for me, just to make a sort of meta point for a moment, I think in some ways that speaks to the hunger that's out there for different ways. It's almost as if we're often told through the marketing or whatever machinery that this is an art form that's primarily about aesthetic experience and kind of great music. All the classical radio stations that say this is great music to relax to, or that we somehow can kind of just bathe in the beauty of it all. But there's also a knowledge and a sense and perhaps a hunger to understand it on these deeper terms. We know there is more going on. We know intuitively that this music is carrying forward, again, to use the Salon reference, kind of these messages in a bottle that have been cast out by these composers, and they are washing up every time onto the dry land of a performance, and we there's a hunger to have other ways of accessing this music, this art form. So it's been moving to be in dialogue with both readers over the last year and now just today again with each of you. I think at best I could maybe do like a little 3-minute riff and try to respond to each of you a little bit, and then we'll continue on in the conversation, I guess. Yeah, I mean, so Jennifer's point, your point, Jennifer, about the ephemerality of dance and memory and forgetting. I love in Apollo's Angels, I love your description of, and I want you to correct me because I'm sure I'll get it wrong. There was a name of someone in classical ballet troupes whose whole job it was actually to be the living embodiment, who's the custodian of the memory of the dance, the ballet master. Yeah. I was very moved by that in the sense of that this is, I write in some ways about how sound as an art form differs from visual cognition, because sound, the composer Murray Schafer has this idea that the eyes draw us outward, but the ears draw us inward, right? Sound penetrates our body. It literally vibrates within us. When music's in a room, there's sort of nowhere to hide, right? I love a quote from the critic John Berger who says, when we listen to music, we find ourselves inside a message. So I appreciated the chance to write about these visceral qualities of music as an art form in the body, how sound contacts us in that way. But here with dance, we have even that sort of to taken to 11, so to speak. We have this art form where memory is entirely embodied, and I do understand what you're talking about with the limits and this kind of this dance between memory and forgetting, and how language is a kind of buttress against the forgetting. There's also, I think part of what we do as historians is also to buttress against the forgetting through the storytelling, through the research from the archives, so that, a lot of these works that I write about, if you hear them on their own terms, you probably wouldn't hear as much, I hope, in them as you would come to hear after learning so much through the writing of a book about where the worlds that they're actually bringing forward. So language has a non-incidental way part of all of this, and we can circle back to talk more about that. I did, just lastly on this subject, come to think about, while I was writing my chapter on the Babi Yar massacre and its commemoration through the Babi Yar Symphony, Putin invaded Ukraine, and one of the early missile attacks was actually hit the site of the Babi Yar Memorial, which was a memorial that I tell the history of memory suppression on that site, because the Soviet war narrative left no room for the particularization of any particular ethnic group as having suffered or been exterminated. It was rather Soviet losses had to be collectivized. So there was a kind of, there was an erasure of memory that happened at that site over many, many years. But the fact that the monument that eventually, the monuments that were there were built up, most of them came after the fall of the Soviet Union. But the fact that physical monuments are subject to destruction, that they can be knocked over, toppled, blown up, subject to the same forces, the reprisal of the same forces to which they're trying to bear witness, struck me very powerfully in that moment. And there was a way in which it helped me realize that music's actually the ephemerality of music can in some way be its own secret strength, right? That monuments can be toppled, books can be burned, but at the end of the day, Shostakovich's Babi Yar Symphony is, in the most powerful sense of the word, untouchable. So that ephemerality in some ways cuts in both directions. Mike, I loved hearing about the Gnesin, the Martinu, and the example of the film. Maybe tell me and tell the rest of us once more the title of the film that you mentioned.
Girl on the Bridge.
Girl on the Bridge. There it is.
He made 10 films in this B-movie style, and 8 of them at least have little memorials to his brother. Some sonic and some visual.
Yeah. Yes, that your comments were also a reminder just to mention that the book is really a first attempt at trying to approach these questions and this kind of the memory lens for our thinking about classical music. But the works I write about is just a small fraction of the works that could be written about this history of memorial music. It could go to many volumes, and I'm often asked the question, what about XP's Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time? There are many other extraordinary works that I don't get to write about, partly for reasons of narrative balance. And we can talk a little bit about sort of how the book is constructed from the prose point of view later, if that becomes relevant. But I appreciate, Mike, your lifting up some of these voices that I did not mention as also really important memorialists in their own way. And Uli, you packed so much into your comments there. Yes, less than 300 pages. Yeah, I think that what to say. The quote about Proust. So you asked if I thought he was right. I guess I would differ from him in saying, because he takes this kind of extreme position that art is the only way to see through another person's eyes, that it's only through art that we can experience someone else's subjectivity. And it's kind of a profound thought. He says, he has a great line that even if we could journey to the moon or to another planet, And still, everything we saw would be kind of bathed in familiar colors because we would be peering through our own eyes. But with art, we have this extrastellar kind of journey we can take through the work of art to see out through someone else's self. And so that's a very Proustian idea, and I think to me a very compelling one. I guess I have no skin in the game about is that the only way. I mean, I'm surely there are others, as you pointed out, and but that's the one, of course, that the book focuses on, and it does. I guess what Proust is partly writing about is also art as a gateway not just to another subjectivity, another self in the universe, but also as a gateway to empathy. There is this sense, back to the question of information versus knowledge. It's sort of like, why do we need another book on this era? There are whole libraries that discuss this time, but there is a way in which I do believe that music as an art form has the possibility to open a more powerful, visceral, directly felt contact that gives us a kind of knowledge as opposed to information about that era. The survivor, Jean Amery, he criticized his own era. He lived in France and wrote in the 60s and 70s about French society's tendency, he wrote, to publish books about the Holocaust in order to forget it. He said that these publications took this kind of raw, unassimilable, and completely morally unexpiated past and put it aside, in his phrase, into the cold storage of memory. The cold storage of history. That was his phrase, the cold storage of history. And so each art form perhaps in a different way, but certainly for me in a very, very vital way, music has a power to burn through history's cold storage. And awakening us to that power was really something that I hope that book could do. Yeah.
Sure. Let me just cut. I have just one thing to say, because it sort of ties to Uli's comment a little bit, and what you're saying. Maybe you do too. But the way I understood what you were doing, and this whole idea of burning through history to memory, was to me also a little bit. It's just touchy because history and memory are different, right? I think we could all agree about that, right? And what I took you to be doing was to be assembling a whole lot of different techniques of writing. You have a kind of thick description, which we saw in what you were reading, where you're using material culture, you're using just the natural world, you're describing a scene. It's almost theatrical. You're using historical narrative. You're telling us what happened. We know what happened, but you're telling us in this context of the scene. You're using biography. You're not writing a biography, but you're using biography. You're pulling together, and then you're using photographs. And it seemed to me not in the way Sebald does. You're using them more illustratively than in order to confuse the possibility of veracity and truth. And so what to me what was key was this idea of the poetic prose, and I'm back to Lorca here, where there's some way that it was a work of interpretation written by somebody who understands music enough to, you don't have a lot of musical examples in here. You're not talking a technical language. And that's a very interesting thing about the book to me, because you're trying, as I read it, and maybe I'm imposing, maybe other people won't agree, but that there's a way in which you are translating music into prose so that we can have it's a certain kind of memory and it's a certain kind of history that is an act of interpretation. And it is a little slippery because it could be, as this Benjaminian thing, but it could be open to interpretation, open to a different outcome, which could be a bad outcome. We could write history wrong, and people do, so, as we know. So I can see the slipperiness, but I felt like in sort of responsible hands, and after all, isn't that what we're always doing in some way? You know, it's an individual account. So those were just some of my thoughts. And I think the prose is part of it. It's part of it's like the final thing in the circle. You have the memory, you have the history, and you've got to give it this prose, this argument, but it's through a language that tries to capture the wordless.
And I think it's also meaningful that, you know, you pose the question in several places, which I think about all the time, which is music really up to this? I mean, for all the talk about music this and music that, I mean, we're talking about some of the most horrific things that have ever happened.
Totally.
You know, I mean, I remember when I first heard the song, "We Are the World." Remember that? There's a little part in the middle that goes, "There are children starving." And I thought, that music is not up to children starving. That is not the level of music to depict that. And the question of, you know, can any music do it, or is music there to comfort us? When we've encountered it, but can it be depicted? And if it's depicted, then are we implicated? So, in other words, one of the pieces I've studied forever is the Gideon Klein's Trio, and in the middle of the middle movement, there's this sort of horrific cello solo that sounds like a scream, but what if I find it beautiful? Am I therefore aestheticizing this experience? And how can I not? I mean, these are seductive composers writing extraordinary things. So, you know, to say that we are, it's in us, but it's also outside of us. They're things for contemplation, but also for immersion at the same time. And I think you really manage in talking about these pieces to sort of fasten on that and raise those questions, which always are compelling for me.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think that. So Benjamin, who Uli mentioned, is in a way has a kind of cameo in the book as a historical figure, and I tap his ideas and quote from him, but even more so his kind of comrade in arms, Theodor Adorno, also has a big kind of presence in the book. Adorno famously said that to write poetry after Auschwitz would be barbaric. That's the one line that he had that people always quote. What gets less frequently quoted or even remembered is the fact that he later went back to this question of art in the wake of atrocity and revised his opinions. And I quote another line, which was that because the world has outlived its own demise, it needs art as an unconscious chronicle. So he ultimately came to revise this question, revise his thesis about this to honor art's power of witness. And I guess that word witness is one that I came to think of a lot about, Jennifer, when you asked about what is the writing doing. There are all these different techniques for doing it, but in a sense, the book itself is a kind of act of re-witnessing. And bearing witness to the music's original act of witness. Adorno, again, actually, Mike, to your point, raises this question about all memorial music. Is this the stuff we should be listening to when we go out to a night at Carnegie Hall? Should we be standing up after listening to music about extermination and clapping? What are we, this is? And he called it his aporia. This idea that any real memorial art that was kind of worthy of the name had to honor something, had to be legible, that the victim's presence had to be legible inside the work of art. And yet, to somehow, he worried that to aestheticize their deaths was somehow to betray them, was somehow to ascribe this kind of these false narratives. And so it raises the question of how do we approach these works? And I ultimately came to think of it as an opportunity that this idea of witnessing actually applies to us as audience members also. When we hear this music, we're actually there not to be entertained in the way that we might be if we go hear a work by Mozart or something, but actually we're there to witness the music's original act of witness, and in so doing, that's how the knowledge of this event, of these events, actually is pass forward knowledge as opposed to information, because we're not just listening, but we're hearing. The Survivor from Warsaw ends with a male chorus representing the doomed prisoners rising up and singing the Shema Yisrael prayer, the central prayer of Judaism, and whose first word is the word Shema, which literally means to hear. So the book is also, in some deeper sense, an argument for not just listening, but also hearing what we listen to.
Yeah, but there's no way out of the paradox, right? Because, first of all, Adorno may be critical of aestheticizing this, but he's philosophizing the aestheticizing of and participating in a similar process in that way. And you know, I deal with these works in Terezin where we don't know what they meant. And so my paradox that keeps me up at night is, well, if they were witnessing about the Holocaust, then you know, who am I to treat it as entertainment? But if they were actually in a particular branch of the Western tradition trying to write a great work, who am I to impose such a heavy-handed narrative on it? And I don't think there's an answer. You can't know.
I think maybe to these terms, sort of in this Frankfurt School, you know, who are only partly responding to many other people are, but I think two things, maybe to aestheticize and to turn into beauty, that used to be a bad thing. They knew, Adorno above everybody, that commercializing, trivializing, and marketing it is the bigger problem, that now there's floods of images all over the place, totally unanchored from any historical knowledge. That is the bigger problem, not that someone made a beautiful work of art. And beauty, for them, ultimately means a very deep, reflective, contemplative attitude, not an absorptive, it just comes in and it just doesn't matter, you memorize it, you whistle it on your way out. So in some ways, beauty for them actually, ultimately, in a weird way, initially they say, you can't turn this into beauty. Then they realize, whoa, this is the only option, because otherwise, either it'll be so easily forgotten and written out of history totally. Secondly, there's still, the moment you're writing about, there isn't really a very culturally accepted narrative available. It's a specific, and you know, people at NYU, you know, Hasia Daina, Marion Kaplan have all worked on this. You know, the kind of Holocaust memory is not in any way culturally anchored in dominant tradition outside of Jewish communities, etc. It's not in Western Europe. It's not in America for a long time. And in some ways, what you say, the one answer is the media, big movies, TV series to big movies. And if you're talking to our students today, 20-year-olds, and they're listening to this, they're thinking, what's the prohibition? To do what? Everything is turned instantly into consumable product, into content. In some ways, they're saying there was a prohibition once to not depict certain things that happened in history. When I teach them Art Spiegelman, Claude Lanzmann, those debates, my students say, oh, wow, that must have been a very arcane debate, because it's like there's been hundreds of movies since then that depict everything, and it's, you know, and you can, you know, generate it automatically. So I think so in this moment, and I think in a weird way, they end up saying beauty is actually a safeguard against worse things. You know, that beauty and so contemplative deep practice. And I wonder, when you're saying, I just want to specify something more specific, what is the problem with being entertained? Because we're not witnessing the actual thing. We're at Carnegie Hall, as you're saying. And what is the problem with actually feeling good about being human in that moment? Is entertainment something else? Like, what is entertainment? Is that shallow and we're not thinking, or where's the problem here?
Well, no, I mean, there are all different ways to think about it, but let's put it in a clumsy metaphor. If some of these pieces written in a place like Terezin were like a message in a bottle saying, they're going to kill me, then me sitting around and being entertained by that maybe is not so savory. But since I can't know what the message was, I have to go back and forth and try to figure it out. Just speaking of films, can I get my dibs in? I do want to play Benjamin in the film version of the book, very much. And the other thing I want is I do want to now make a movie. You know, one of the fabulous passages in his book is about Richard Strauss deciding he's going to get somebody out of a concentration camp, out of Terezin, and getting his chauffeur to drive his car up and say, I am Richard Strauss, the great German composer, please. And it was just an amazing, amazing sort of encapsulated everything. It's beautiful.
Thanks for mentioning that. I mean, that I should give, for those of you who haven't read it, I should try to give it, I should probably say a word on behalf of the fact that there are just, one of the things that apropos your comment, Jennifer, on sort of approaches to telling this and re-witnessing, the book has a lot of stories. Mike just gave one of them. In fact, it does a lot of its big ideas, thinking work, so to speak, through the storytelling, and that was a real part, a very conscious decision, and part of how I hoped to have its questions and the thinking I'm inviting readers to do with me reach a broader audience outside the academy, was to kind of to interpenetrate the storytelling and the bigger ideas and questions.
Jeremy, in addition to that, can you say a little bit about, you are also a character in the book,
Right.
about your approach to that and why, because there are sort of almost set pieces in the book in which you know, your journey back to the place where it happened.
The book took about 10 years to write and research, and in the process, I visited a lot of archives in 5 different countries, and a lot of, not just archives, but the sites that the music, that was connected to the history that the music was carrying forward. So the site of the Babi Yar massacre outside of Kyiv, I actually went and found the stump of Goethe's oak tree that's still there in the camp of Buchenwald, and maybe come back to that one in a moment. Went to Strauss's home in Garmisch, and I found that, you know, it's also in some ways it's a book. It's a book about different carriers of memory, and one of them that has always spoken to me deeply is landscape, or place, I should say, more generally. So the relationship of sort of how much of the music was in these places and how much of the places was in the music. Something I couldn't unremember the places after I had visited them. Once I would then go back and listen to the piece of music. So I thought, really, how much richer might it be to give readers the opportunity to come with me. So I write these trips into the book. There's first person, and I think that in another way, it was a possibility. It was a way of trying to enact the sensibility that the book is inviting a reader to think about, to try on for size for themselves about what it might mean to live more deeply with the presence of the past by living more deeply with the presence of art, and those journeys were a way of inviting readers with me to think about that way of approaching things. The last thing I'll say was just that was extremely moving to see Goethe's oak. We began with that. The stump is there in Buchenwald now, and when I went, it was covered with tiny stones. That in keeping with the Jewish tradition of placing a stone on the memory of a grave site, of a tombstone, to show that the person had not been forgotten. And in some deep way, you know, the book was also an attempt to place stones, my own sorts of stones, on the memory of the victims of these horrible wars, but also, in a sense, it's also the placing of a stone at the memory of European humanism, and asking in a kind of Benjaminian sense, apropos Uli's question, whether there are also sparks of hope that can be recovered in this history through these stories, through this music, that we can perhaps bring out for all of us in our lives now, sort of especially in these times of darkness.
I want to ask you a question, Mike, and you basically, and maybe Jenny also. So when you listen to such a piece, and then you know as a musicologist, historian from the program notes, that this is actually somebody, in a way, appealing to life or to something which we know from historical hindsight is foreclosed because this terrible thing happened to them ultimately. But music, as you said, Berger said, you're inside the message. So in the piece, you're actually moved by the music. And I wonder whether the point is that you are, for a moment, able to suspend this knowledge, the foreclosed knowledge, what will happen, the foregone conclusion of history, which is historical knowledge. And I've done this work on photography, where, to simplify this, historians tend to see photographs as illustrating known history. But photo people actually see photographs as opening up the next step that will happen, and we don't know yet, because in the photograph, the future is still totally open, which totally open is kind of impossible to say, because these people, according to historical records, will die. But they're looking at the camera, not with that knowledge. They're actually looking at us. And in some ways, that kind of, they're moved out of time. They're looking at us. So these people are singing to us, now embodied to other people. This music is singing and holding us. And that other knowledge is historical knowledge that you know, which in some way, I think, denies them that humanity of not knowing what the future is, of hoping against hope, which, you know what I mean? That it actually it keeps something suspended. Whereas you can say, well, you're wrong, actually, this terrible thing happens. But from within the music, they're still sounding something else. And if we don't keep that alive, then history is just foregone conclusion, and you don't need to study it then anymore, because then you know everything has happened, but then there's nothing to be revealed yet. So I feel this is this Benjaminian, there's a spark of contingency, he calls it. He has all sorts of metaphors, because he cannot put a word on it. He comes up with these metaphors, profane illumination, da-da-da. He wants to say, what is activated in us in that moment when we suspend the knowledge, the foregone conclusion of history has already happened for them. For them, history hasn't happened yet. And that's why I thought music comes to life in this way, and art comes to life without denying all this other stuff. It's not another way of being in the world. Of course, history happened. But you know what? It opens up something for a moment. And when you discover that photograph on the piano, that is the brother who's lost. That's going to be replayed in every time in the movie, but in some ways you say, well, we know what happens to him. You sort of shut that off. So I'm just trying to see whether music brings you into that for a moment where you're suspended in this other temporal space, when you said not linear time.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a beautiful distillation of really one of the central things I hope readers will think about when exactly, historians actually sometimes do talk about, they caution us against what they call backshadowing, which is reading the past through the prism of the present. And definitely through music, and certainly from my approach as a writer, was trying to honor some of these lives and their complexity and contingency of the lived experiences at the time, and not just view this pre-war history, which the book goes into all the way back into the 19th century, as a kind of these figures as a kind of characters, pawns in some prescripted march to the abyss. No, this is actually, this was a future that they were people living in a present tense where the future had many different possibilities, and not just one dark and doom-laden one. And the music, in some sense, and I hope the writing, brings alive that multiplicity and that humanity.
I think this is as good a place as any to end, and we will continue the conversation. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Uli and Mike.